So just to give you a sense of how this run distributed itself this year, on the bottom is the date, and this is size. And these are sockeye, these are the large fish. And they tended to be towards the front end, so early to mid-October. I should say these are not the fish that arrived, just the ones I was able to sample, which is a small subset. And then you had these smaller fish that extended much farther along. And in fact, visually, I didn't get any samples from this, but they extended well into December. So it's not obvious to this that these are separate populations, but there certainly is the idea that something small is extending beyond where we see sockeye. And I'll just say on visual observations of the fish in the stream, it's much more obvious than it looks here. So looks like we had a strong year. I'm working on otoliths to try to get a sense of how old these fish are, if they really came from the 2017 fish. So there's a question of, are they genetically distinct? And we're really fortunate now in that Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has a new panel, a genetic panel, that's really sensitive in picking apart population level variation in kokanee and sockeye. And so this is fairly recent that they have this, and you might have heard Jim talk about this earlier. It's being used with Lake Sammamish fish. So then the question is, are they distinct and are they native? So leaving out the mystery NERCA now, this is a diagram more or less representing the genetic variation across a whole bunch of different aspects of the genome, the separate groups that seem to come out of that. So there's early run Sammamish River Issaquah Creek fish. So those are gone, but fortunately they're samples. They stand out as distinctive. These are all Lake Sammamish kokanee from various sources. These are Bear Creek sockeye. So it's still unclear exactly where they come from. And then these are introduced sockeye. So this is what would have been in Issaquah and is running in the Cedar River. So looking at this, yeah, you know, we see 4 fairly distinct clumps. This one maybe not so much. So I was able to get a lot of samples this fall, and we ran them through the same analysis. And what was really cool, and I'll mention that I had help from Trout Unlimited with this, is for fish from 2020 and from 2017, they form a really nice cluster that does not overlap with what's in Bear Creek or with what we know to be introduced in the Cedar River. So these fish here, these ones in the red dots are ones I collected. These are ones I collected. Even though these fish are spawning in the same place and sometimes overlap in time, they're not overlapping genetically, which I think is really cool. Certainly suggests that this is a genetically distinct population. We have some more work to do on this, but at first glance, it's encouraging. Not only are they genetically distinct, they also tend to cluster over with native Lake Sammamish fish, which I would expect if both the Lake Sammamish fish and these late running kokanee were native. So that's really exciting for me, and I think maybe for others. There are also some of these samples from 2011. So after these results came from the 2017 and 20 fish, WDFW ran some of their samples from 2011 that were mentioned in the Kokanee Blueprint report. And it turns out they land right on top of the fish that I was getting in 2017 and 2020. So not only does this 3-year cycle seem to hold, but the fish that are there are genetically part of the same group. So it's not just a one-off thing. So we have good genetic and time evidence that there's a distinct population that's out there. So the remaining question, after the idea that they're genetically distinct and that they seem to run on this 3-year cycle, is, are they native fish? And I'm just going to mention briefly what this graph is showing. Again, these are sockeye up here, sizes on the y-axis. These are either kokanee, either mystery NERCA or residuals. The early run fish that I catch, especially if I catch them up in Little Bear Creek, so outside of the Sammamish, they fall in with the Bear Creek sockeye. So these fish, these large sockeye, and these little ones that happen at more or less the same time seem to be part of one population. The small ones that I get, especially late, fall out as this distinct group, which I've labeled purple. I do have this one early one. There always has to be one data point in there that makes you scratch your head. I think it was a big run and some of these fish were showing up early, but in any event, these late ones are certainly distinct from even the early small fish in most cases. And all these gray dots are ones that I have samples for. We just haven't done the genetics on them yet. So what would we do with this information? Well, ever since I stood on Wally's bridge and looked down and saw those kokanee and then learned that that used to be the case down lower in the basin, I've really thought restoration would be a great thing to do. We have streams down here that are close to barren of salmon, even though at one point they had thousands of kokanee running through them. The case for doing that gets much stronger if we can demonstrate that these fish that we're seeing in some tributaries in the Sammamish actually are native. And fortunately, native fish were collected in the late 1800s from Lake Washington. And currently we have samples down at WDFW from which we're trying to get enough genetic information to pin down whether what we're finding now, first in Lake Sammamish, but also these mystery NERCA, line up with what was native in the basin in the 1800s. So that is a step yet to be taken. And this is O.B. Johnson, the person who actually collected these way back in the 1800s. So we want to do those genetic comparisons with historic fish. I'm optimistic that we'll be able to get the genetic information we need out of those fish. And then once we do that, I think we'd be in a good basis for doing many of the same kinds of restoration and supplementation efforts that are going on in Lake Sammamish and extending those down into Swamp Creek, which is a great little stream, but has no kokanee in it now, used to. Streams in Lake Forest Park like Lion Creek and Maculaire Creek, so that we can have a similar approach basin-wide. The big difference is that Lake Washington is a very different beast from Lake Sammamish. And one of the encouraging things is these mystery NERCA seem to be doing pretty well. There were a lot of them this year. So the hope is that we might have a closely related population of native kokanee that may be in a lake that's providing, let's say, a more stable environment. So there's a reservoir there. And if we ever get in the conditions where we have really low genetic diversity in Lake Sammamish kokanee, rather than having to try to cross them with something from outside the basin, we might even have native fish within the basin that could help supplement some of their genetic diversity. So I've been doing some work with remote site incubators with the help of Dave Kyle and Jim Bauer. So we have coho running in remote site incubators here. And all of that, as far as I'm concerned, is just prologue to eventually being able to put some kokanee eggs in there.